Hey everybody, welcome. My name is Matthew. Today we are continuing on with our series on the United States national debt, trying to put everything in perspective, looking at taxes, borrowing, spending, interest, and money printing. Have the 230 plus year of history here for the United States debt. You can see on linear scale, things look like they start to take off from the 70s or the 80s, but this is a function of linear scale, of course. $34.6 trillion in debt. Now, we looked in the prior videos, and do check those out if you haven't seen them. We looked at how much on a trailing 12-month basis the government collected as a percentage of the debt in taxes. We looked how much they actually spent and then overspent what they collected in taxes, or in other words, the deficit, or in other words, how much you increase the debt each year. That's this black line. We looked at the interest rate, which is once you increase the debt more than you can, once you increase the spending, I should say, more than you can take in taxes, you will have a debt. Once you have the debt, you got to pay interest on it. So from the Great Depression times, we have that. And then, of course, sometimes the deficits, that is the amount of money that the government spends beyond what it takes in taxes, needs to be printed to make up for a shortfall. And that's here on a trailing 12-month basis. Now, as we've basically, this is the culmination of the trailing 12-month percentages of the national debt here, this video. And it's a lot to look at. As I showed you in the very first video, it's a lot to look at all these different lines and try to understand really, where we are. So for that, I have two more metrics to show you. And these are going to blend all of these different percentages together so we can make sense of them. All right, so we're going to go on to another chart here. It's the same chart, but on this chart, what we have here in red, I'm showing you the deficit cents on $1 tax, rather than try to make sense of all these different percentages, how much of the debt was collected in taxes, then spent, so on and so forth, how much was printed. Let's just look here at the deficit cents on $1 tax. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the 1800s, most of the 1800s here, so perhaps in the future, hopefully in the future, but for this analysis, we're tabling that. We're starting here in the late 1800s, during the classical gold standard, to World War I, to through the Bretton Woods system. Now, generally speaking, if you just want to look at this, a smattering of this, if it's negative, it's good towards the national debt. If it's positive, it's bad. Okay? And what is it saying? Well, let's just find a period here. Let's look at October 1984. Okay, the national debt was $1.6 trillion. And the deficit was 32 cents on $1 of tax. What does that mean? It means during this period, that means from starting November 1983, ending October 1984, always on a trailing 12-month basis, the government deficit spent. Okay, so let's forget how much the tax was, how much they collected, so on and so forth, but let's just assume that for every dollar of taxes they collected, they spent $1.32. That's what this chart is telling us at this point in time. Okay, so what that means is they deficit spent 32 cents. They spent $1.32, took in $1 in taxes. So what you'll see in the tooltip here, the tomato line here, what this cent value is when you add it to $1, it's how much the government spent on any program: military, agriculture, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These values are added onto $1, and it's going to show you how much the government spent. So you can see in periods of major deficit spend, which, as we talked about for a long time, wars, depressions, World War I, we're off the chart. This maxes out at 100 pennies on the dollar, $1. You can see here, let's just somewhere here, during the peak, the cresting of World War I, the government deficit spent 476 cents on $1. So that means they actually spent over the trailing 12 months 576 cents, $5.76 per every dollar of taxes that they received. And the deficit is -1, so 476 cents. A huge increase in deficit spending. All right. And what that means is, as you can see in the green shaded area, as I've shown you many, many times now, you're increasing the debt massively compared to what it was 12 months before, 24 months before, so on and so forth. So the debt before the United States entered the war was somewhere around $4 billion, $5 billion. After World War I, $27 billion. Same thing happened in the Great Depression, right? A lot of government spending to try and alleviate the economy there, and World War II. Now, interestingly, this still shows us that if you look at the national debt itself, it doesn't necessarily tell us where the economy is going, okay? Because here was the Roaring 20s. And during the Roaring 20s, the United States was paying down its World War I debt. So structurally, that actually looked better, all right? So when this deficit spend is negative, look in the tooltip, for example, here in 1926 January, it's negative 21 cents. Well, what does that mean? Add that, this is per every dollar of taxes. So if they took in $1 in taxes, they actually had a surplus during this period. So for the trailing 12 months, let's take it just to the year December so you understand. In 2025, all right, $20 billion in debt, that's actually paid down 20 cents on the dollar. So in 1925, the government received $1 for every dollar in taxes. They only spent 79 cents. $1 minus 21 cents. They only spent 79 cents. It means they ran a surplus of 21 cents, and surpluses pay down the debt. That's how it. And you would think that this is actually looking good here, but we had the Great Depression. Okay, so this is part of the reason why people say that deficit spending is a good thing. I'm not saying that. Economists say that, but there's more. You need to look more into the whole picture to understand that. But anyway, this was a very tumultuous time. Gold was confiscated from Americans during this time. FDR was doing a lot of deficit spending during the Great Depression, the New Deal. All the government agencies started up during this period, and a large amount of government agencies started up during this period. A lot of spending, all right, where you're spending $1, $2, $3 per every dollar. Well, let's say 1 to 2 per every dollar that was received in taxes. Okay. And then when we go here again to, let's just zoom in to the 70s, 80s. I've said this as well during prior videos. Remember, this is where a lot of economists today, that were growing up during this time, when they were in university in the 70s and the 80s, or the 60s even, they cut their teeth during this time where, okay, it's just too crazy here. Federal Reserve was kind of, it's practice. Federal Reserve isn't in the picture yet. I'll bring them in. But, the government didn't understand how to properly deficit spend, so on and so forth. But towards the end of the Vietnam War, even after we closed the gold window, just this period here was really more stable. Government really understood deficit spending. And, they would spend here as much as 40 cents over what they took in taxes. So again, what that means is they deficit spent 40 cents on the dollar. So they took in $1 in taxes. They spent $1 plus 40 cents. That's what this chart is showing you. So the higher this red line is, the worse. But what I'm showing you is economists during this time that were learning about deficit spending and debt and how the government needs to have a role in the economy. This sort of level of, let's say, 10 cents on the dollar deficit spending, 20 cents on the dollar deficit spending, 30 cents on the dollar deficit spending, didn't prove to be horribly bad. This was known as the Great Moderation. Okay. But again, it doesn't always show you when there's going to be a crisis, because actually if this thing is below zero, i.e. there's a surplus on every dollar in taxes, as there was with the end of the Clinton years, all right, this little cresting of debt here you see, just a couple years, even into the start of the Bush years, because of the trailing 12 months, we were spending we received $1 in taxes. And in this case, you see negative 6 cents deficit spend. That means it's a surplus. So for the year 2000, the year of Y2K, the government only spent 94 cents on every dollar received in taxes. So they had a surplus of 6 cents on the dollar. And yet what happened? We had the Y2K scare. We had the dot-com boom bust. Of course, we'd have 9/11 after, which added to the turmoil. But, there's no given looking at this chart when there's going to be a financial crisis or a stock market crisis or a debt crisis. But It's just to show you that this idea that there wasn't a crisis generally during this period is why economists today say the deficit spending isn't so bad. And I don't agree with that, but you can understand why they say that. Again, what this red shaded area is doing is it's putting in perspective the tax and spend side, which we have on this chart, which we've been through in the prior videos, but there's a lot of lines. I want to put them together now as far as cents on the dollar so you can understand it. Look at the Bush years. All right, so this is the Bush years coming in 2001 to 2008, basically the global financial crisis. We deficit spent, again, back up to this 30 cents on the dollar, Iraq war, Afghanistan war, a lot of spending here. So every dollar in taxes, the government would spend $1.30 or 30 cents over budget. Deficit spending, not a problem. Why don't we just spend and borrow to pay for our expenses? Well, even when the deficit spending on every dollar of taxes shrunk to about 19, 20 cents here on the eve of the financial crisis, what happened? A financial crisis. So you'd have to look at other indicators to show us why we got there. But once it did happen, deficit spending just increased again massively. We spent 100 cents on a dollar per taxes. What that means is you take the dollar, add 100 cents or a dollar. So we spent $2 for every dollar in taxes. We deficit spent $1. At the peak of the financial crisis here, mid-2009, we can say is the peak of the financial crisis. This is always on a trailing 12-month basis. Remember, always on a trailing 12-month basis. When we look at these are flows of the budget, income, taxes, minus expenses. Government spending, a lot of spending here, post-GFC. And then, let's zoom in till today, they tried to get it under control, okay, after the massive amounts of borrowing that happened. Remember, the Federal Reserve is not in here yet. I mentioned that erroneously earlier, but the Federal Reserve is not in the picture yet. I will show you that in a second, the print side of deficit spending. Taking a moment to remind you that this show is brought to you by Trezor, home of the original Bitcoin hardware wallet. For over 10 years now, Trezor means business in Bitcoin security and functionality. When using their wallet software Trezor Suite to connect to the Bitcoin network, you're automatically connected via Tor, protecting your identity and giving you full control of your coins in a fully open source manner, both on the software level and on the hardware level. So head on over to Trezor.io to grab your Trezor Safe 3 with a secure element, Model T with a touchscreen, or the original Trezor 1, as well as a ton of available accessories to back up your keys and keep your coins safe. This show is proud to be associated with Trezor. But they spent a lot. They tried to get it down under control here now from the mid-2010s, 2014 until COVID, and they kind of did. They're only spending, at this point, only 7 cents over every dollar received in taxes. That's theoretically looking kind of good. Well, what happened? COVID happened, and then they had to explode the debt again. At the peak COVID, they're spending $1.50. I saw, July 2020, $1.45 on every dollar in taxes. So that means they received taxes, and then they spent the dollar that they received plus the deficit, which is 145 cents. So they spent here, government spending during this period was $2.45. So that's the relationship of taxes coming in, spending going out, what you have left over, the deficit. The deficit is an increase in the debt. It's usually a deficit. Sometimes there's a surplus, which we see here when it's negative. All right, but even when there's a surplus, have we hit the sweet spot? You have to look at other indicators. Okay, so deficit spent again a lot during COVID. That's come down. A lot of inflation. They've tried to rein that in, but here, this is where things don't look good at all. If you look at the spend in relation to the tax, I should zoom in just to there. Had the going out one more month than it needed to be. The spend in relation to the tax, we're pretty high. 69 cents on the dollar. The government right now, at this moment, is receiving on a trailing 12-month basis that for every dollar they're receiving in taxes, they're spending $1.69. Their deficit spending 69 cents. That's pretty high. Let's zoom it out. I'll tell you the all-time average. Just to keep it simple during this video, what's the all-time average of this deficit spend number? 28 cents. 28 cents on the dollar. That is the all-time average, 28 cents on the dollar. And where are we today? 69.70 cents on the dollar. So we're over double, well over double the average deficit spend. We're getting pretty close to, we're getting high again, not as high as COVID levels, but we're getting as high as post-GFC levels. Right? You have to go back to 2012 to find a deficit spend that high versus what the government collects in taxes. That's not looking great. So once you remember what we've been able to do here, we've combined the green line here with the black line and looked at it as far as cents on the dollar so we can really understand. And you see here, going back to the actual, this is percent of the debt, we're receiving less. The government, when I say we, the government's receiving less in taxes as a percentage of the debt, which is huge. It's also deficit spending, that black line. So if you look at that here, which puts it all together, cents on the dollar, 70, 65, 69, 70 cents on the dollar we're spending. That's a pretty high level. And as I told you, if you look at this over the all-time average, since I have data from the late 1800s, you can see it swings wildly, but the all-time average is 28 cents. The deficit spend, for every dollar the government takes in tax revenue, they spend $1.28, meaning the deficit is 28 cents. And that figure is more than double now. See where that tomato is relative to all the prior history on the graph. You only see the GFC, you see COVID, World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression has a higher cents on the dollar deficit spend than we have now. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. In the next video, I'll layer in the print as far as cents on the dollar so we can understand how that fits into the picture, how much the government prints money to make up for deficit shortfalls. Thanks for watching.